The night was colder than any she could remember. The prairie wind swept hard across the open land, carrying with it a bite that cut through wool and leather as if nothing could hold it back. Snow clung to the ground in uneven patches, glistening beneath the pale light of a half-hidden moon. Every sound was sharper in that frozen air, every creak of the trees and every distant howl of a coyote. For a widow traveling alone, it was not just the chill that pierced her bones, but the weight of a silence that felt endless, pressing down on her chest with every step. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric was worn and offered little warmth. The path she followed was faint, marked only by a few broken twigs and the memory of her own determination. It had been months since her husband was buried, and the home they once shared felt too hollow, too heavy with ghosts she could not bear. Some nights, she thought of turning back, of surrendering to the loneliness that pressed in from all sides, but something stronger kept her moving forward. It was not just survival, though survival mattered. It was the hope, faint as the stars above, that life could still hold meaning, even in the midst of loss. She had heard whispers in town of an Apache band that wintered in these parts, deep in the wooded valley where the wind could not so easily steal their fire. The people of the settlement spoke of them with fear and mistrust, their voices heavy with old anger and half-remembered tales. Yet to the widow, those stories carried something else. A strange pull, a curiosity that tugged at her even when she tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was because she too felt like an outsider now, marked by grief in a world that had no patience for the broken. The storm had begun earlier that evening, flurries tumbling down in a hurried dance. She had tried to find shelter, but the land stretched wide and bare, giving her nothing but the brittle skeletons of trees for company. By the time she stumbled into the valley, her breath was short, her legs trembling with exhaustion. That was when she saw it, the faint glow of fire, a flicker of orange against the dark. Her heart raced. It could mean danger. It could mean salvation. Still she moved toward it, the pull of warmth and life too strong to ignore. The closer she came, the clearer it grew. A cluster of tipis, their shapes rising out of the snow, steady and sure against the storm. Shadows moved within, tall figures outlined against the light of flames. Her first instinct was to turn back, to vanish into the trees before anyone noticed her presence. But the cold was merciless, and her body screamed for rest. Every step away from that fire might mean the difference between life and death. She hesitated on the edge of the clearing, her breath forming clouds in the air, her hands trembling as she clutched the shawl tight. Then one of the tipi flaps shifted, and a man stepped out. His frame was tall, broad across the shoulders, his long dark hair catching the glow of the fire behind him. His gaze swept the clearing and landed on her, sharp as an arrow. For a moment, neither moved. She felt the weight of his eyes on her, steady and unreadable, as though he could see past the frost on her face and into the storm of her heart. Fear prickled in her chest, but so did something else. An odd calm, a strange certainty that this encounter was not by chance. He did not call out, nor did he lift a weapon. He simply watched her, waiting, his presence commanding without a single word. The widow drew in a shaky breath, unsure of what she should do. She had been raised to fear men like him, to believe they were ruthless and untamed. Yet standing there, with the wind biting at her back and his fire beckoning her forward, she saw something different. Not an enemy, not a stranger. A man rooted in this land in a way she could never be, steady as the mountains and silent as the snow. She stepped forward, her boots crunching in the frozen earth. Every movement felt heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. The man did not retreat. He did not move to stop her either. When she reached the teepee, he lifted the flap and nodded once, a gesture simple, yet filled with meaning. Inside, the warmth hit her first. The air smelled of wood smoke and herbs, carrying a weight that felt both strange and comforting. The fire burned low in the center, casting long shadows that danced across the canvas walls. She paused just inside, her body stiff with uncertainty, yet her soul aching with relief. For the first time in months, she was not alone against the cold. The man entered behind her, letting the flap fall closed. The sound of the storm faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the soft rhythm of breath. She turned to him, searching his face for answers, for intentions she could not yet read. His eyes held hers steadily, unflinching, as though he too sought something in her presence he had not expected. No words were spoken, none were needed yet. The silence between them was not empty, but charged, like the moment before thunder breaks. She felt the tension coil in the air, a question neither dared to ask, a fate neither dared to name. As she lowered herself near the fire, she wondered what path had brought her here, to this moment, to this meeting inside an Apache tipi, while winter raged outside. Her grief, her loneliness, her endless search for meaning, all of it seemed to lead here, as though the land itself had guided her steps. The man sat across from her, his expression unreadable yet softened by the flicker of firelight. She knew nothing of his name, his people, or his story, but she felt the stirrings of something that frightened her more than the cold ever could. It was the possibility that this night might change everything, that two lives marked by loss and shaped by silence might find a new path together. Still, questions pressed against her chest. Would he allow her to stay, even for a night? Would his people see her as a threat, or as something worse? And why did his eyes, dark and steady, hold such weight when they met her own? The storm howled outside, but inside the teepee the world narrowed to the two of them, firelight painting their faces in shades of gold and shadow. The widow's hands trembled as she reached them toward the flames, not only for warmth but for courage. She could not yet know if this place would save her or undo her completely. The man shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving hers, and the faintest flicker of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. It was enough to send a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She swallowed hard, the unspoken question burning in her chest. She wanted to speak, to ask why he had not turned her away, to know what lay behind the silence he carried so heavily. But before the words could leave her lips, the teepee flap rustled in the wind, and another shadow fell across the entrance. Her heart leapt, fear tightening her throat as she realized they were no longer alone. The shadow lingered at the entrance, tall and unmoving, the outline cast against the canvas wall by the fire's glow. The widow stiffened where she sat, her breath catching as she gripped the edges of her shawl tighter. The man across from her did not flinch, his eyes lifted toward the flap, steady and calm, though there was something sharp in his stillness, something that spoke of a watchful readiness. The flap shifted, and another figure stepped inside, this one smaller than the first, wrapped in a blanket of animal hide. The newcomer's face was partially hidden by the flickering light, but the widow could see a pair of dark eyes narrowing as they fell upon her. A low murmur passed between the two men, the kind of exchange that carried weight, though she could not understand the words. She sat in silence, her pulse quick and unsteady, wondering if she had made a mistake in stepping into this place that was not hers. The smaller man spoke again, his tone questioning, his gaze never leaving her. For a moment she felt like a trespasser caught where she had no right to be. The taller man responded, his voice calm, though firm, as though he had already made his decision. The widow could not grasp their meaning, but she recognized the cadence of authority in his voice, the sound of someone who did not bend easily. The other man hesitated, then with a reluctant nod, pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and retreated back into the storm. When the flap closed again, silence filled the teepee. The widow's heart was still racing, but the man across from her seemed unchanged, as if he had expected the interruption. The fire crackled softly, its light painting the walls with restless shadows. She lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of what had just passed. He had allowed her to remain, though she did not know why. She was a stranger, a widow without kin, and yet here she sat within the shelter of his fire, while the storm raged outside. Her mind drifted back to the town she had left behind, to the whispers of those who spoke of the Apache with both fear and resentment. Stories told around wooden tables, laced with warnings meant to frighten. Yet none of those tales had prepared her for the quiet steadiness of the man before her. He had not turned her away, nor had he looked at her with the hatred she had been told to expect. Instead, his eyes carried something else, something harder to name, something that unsettled her in a way she did not want to admit. The widow's thoughts tangled with memories of her own life, of the farm where she had once lived with her husband. She recalled the small wooden house, its roof patched more times than she could count, the fields that stretched wide and golden in the summer sun. They had worked side by side, their hands calloused and their bodies weary, but their lives had felt whole, steady in their simplicity. His passing had broken that steadiness, leaving her adrift in a world that no longer seemed to recognize her. People in town had pitied her at first, offering kind words that turned hollow with time. Pity had shifted into judgment, and whispers of weakness followed her as she walked the dusty streets. She could not bear it any longer. So she had left, guided only by the instinct that something waited for her beyond the boundaries of the settlement. She had followed the pull of the land itself, though she could not explain why. Perhaps it was madness, or perhaps it was survival. Yet here she was, her fate tangled now with strangers whose lives were a mystery to her. The man across the fire stirred slightly, breaking her thoughts. His movements were deliberate, each shift of his hand carrying the grace of someone accustomed to silence. He reached for a pouch near the fire and withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs, tossing them gently into the flames. A sharp, earthy scent filled the air, mingling with the smoke. She watched him, uncertain of the meaning behind the act, but the calm in his expression eased her trembling breath. Though she longed to ask questions, words stuck in her throat. Her language would not carry across the divide between them, not without confusion or missteps. Still, she wanted to know who he was, why he had let her stay, and what place she now held in the heart of this valley. The night stretched on, the storm outside relentless in its fury. From time to time the distant cries of wolves echoed across the snow, yet the fire within the teepee held back the weight of the wilderness. The widow felt the heaviness in her body from days of wandering without rest. Her eyelids fought to stay open, though her heart urged her to remain alert. At last, weariness won. She rested her head against her arm, her body curling near the fire, and the warmth lulled her into uneasy sleep. When she woke, pale light filtered through the walls of the teepee, soft but sharp against her eyes. The storm had quieted, leaving behind a hushed stillness. She stirred slowly, her body stiff but warmed by the night's fire. The man was gone. Only the faint embers remained, glowing faintly in the ashes. For a moment, panic gripped her. Had he abandoned her, left her as suddenly as he had allowed her in? Then she heard it, the sound of voices outside, low and steady. Children's laughter followed, quick and sharp against the cold morning air. Curiosity tugged at her, and though fear whispered that she should remain inside, she could not resist. She lifted the flap slightly, peering out into the clearing. What she saw tightened her chest with awe and unease. The camp was alive with movement. Women carried bundles of wood and water, their steps sure despite the snow beneath their feet. Children chased one another, their laughter weaving through the morning air like song. Men gathered near a larger fire, their expressions grave as they spoke among themselves. And there, near the edge of the clearing, stood the man from the night before. He was speaking to another elder, his stance calm but resolute, his hand gesturing briefly toward the teepee she had just stepped from. The elder's eyes followed, meeting hers in that instant. She froze, caught beneath the weight of a gaze that seemed to pierce deeper than words ever could. The elder did not speak, not to her, but he leaned closer to the man, his voice low. Whatever was said carried weight, for the man's shoulders tightened though his face did not change. The widow dropped the flap, retreating into the safety of the shadows inside. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart thundering with the knowledge that her presence was no secret here. She was not invisible, nor could she remain hidden for long. She sat again near the fading fire, trying to calm her thoughts. 1,000 questions pressed at her, but one louder than the rest. What would happen now that she had stepped into their world? Would she be cast out into the snow, or would she be allowed to remain under their watchful eyes? And if she remained, what would it mean for her life, for the grief that still clung to her like a second skin? The teepee flap stirred again, and the man entered, his presence filling the space with quiet strength. He met her eyes, and though his face betrayed little, she sensed the weight of a choice yet to be made. He carried something in his hands, a wooden bowl filled with food, and set it gently before her. His gesture was simple, yet it carried with it a meaning she could not ignore. The widow's hands shook as she accepted the bowl, warmth spreading through her fingers. Hunger gnawed at her, but so did the heaviness of knowing that every act within this place was layered with meaning she could not yet grasp. She took a careful bite, the taste grounding her, reminding her of the fragile thread that now bound her to this camp, to these people, and most of all, to the man whose silence held more questions than answers. He sat across from her again, watching quietly, the firelight catching in his eyes. The weight of his gaze did not frighten her this time. Instead, it pulled at her, deepening the mystery of what tied them together. Yet the storm inside her heart was far from calmed, for though the storm outside had passed, a greater one was rising, one that neither she nor he could escape. And as she held his gaze, she knew their encounter had only just begun. The widow held the bowl close, the steam rising into her face, warming her skin though the cold still pressed in from the outside world. Each bite settled heavy in her stomach, but with it came a new awareness. She was not just a guest sheltered for the night. She was an intruder whose presence carried weight she could not measure. Across the fire the man watched, silent as ever, his steady eyes unreadable. The air between them thickened with questions she dared not voice. Outside, voices rose again. The rhythm of the camp carried on, but there was something sharper now, an edge she had not heard before. She caught fragments of sound, laughter that felt less like joy and more like challenge, the low rumble of men's voices carrying doubt. She wondered if they spoke of her, if her arrival had unsettled more than just the man who had let her inside. The flap opened once more, and this time a woman stepped in. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her shoulders wrapped in a shawl of woven patterns. Her eyes went first to the widow, narrowing slightly, then to the man, who gave a brief nod. The woman lowered herself to the ground, her movements slow but sure, and began to speak in a tone low and steady. Though the widow could not understand, she felt the weight of the words. The man responded sparingly, each word chosen with care, his voice steady though his jaw tightened. The widow shifted uncomfortably, feeling the air thicken again with unspoken judgment. The woman's eyes returned to her, scanning her as if searching for answers written in her face. At last, the elder woman rose and left, but the heaviness lingered long after. The widow's chest tightened. She knew enough of people to recognize the tone of disapproval. Her being here was not something easily accepted. That night, sleep was restless. Shadows shifted in her dreams, voices calling her name from the edges of the storm. When she awoke, the fire had burned down to ash, and the silence was different, heavier than before. She pulled her shawl closer and listened to the camp beyond the teepee walls. The crack of axes striking wood. Children's feet pattering across frozen ground. Horses snorting in the cold. Yet beneath it all was the tension she could not shake. As the day stretched on, she began to see the patterns of life within the camp. The people moved with a rhythm that spoke of long winters survived and hard lessons learned. Women tended the fires and prepared food, their voices weaving together in quiet song. Men worked with tools, their focus sharp, their strength visible in every movement. Children roamed freely, their laughter chasing one another through the snow, yet always watched by careful eyes. It was a world complete in itself, and she could not help but feel how much she did not belong. Still, her presence had become impossible to ignore. Wherever she stepped, eyes followed, some filled with curiosity, others with suspicion. Once, a group of younger men stood together, speaking in hushed tones, their glances sharp when they fell upon her. The sound of their laughter was not kind. Though she could not know their words, she felt the sting of their doubt, the question of why she had been allowed into their world when so many walls stood against outsiders. The man who had first welcomed her did not falter in his quiet watch. Each day he appeared at her side with food or water, not indulgent, not unkind, but steady, as though he had decided she would not be cast out, no matter what others whispered. Yet he did not explain his reasons, and she was left with nothing but silence where answers should have been. One afternoon, while gathering wood near the edge of the camp, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with one of the young men she had noticed before. His eyes were sharp, his expression wary, his voice low as he spoke words she did not know. But though the language was foreign, the meaning was clear. He pointed toward the valley beyond, gesturing sharply for her to leave. His hands cut the air with the force of command, and his eyes burned with anger. She froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her tongue failed her. The man's voice grew harsher, his gestures more forceful. Then another voice cut across the space, firm and commanding. The tall man approached, his presence enough to still the confrontation. The younger man bristled but did not resist, his jaw tight as he spat one last word and stalked away. The widow's chest rose and fell with relief, but it was short-lived. For though she had been spared in that moment, the message was clear. Not all welcomed her here. Not all believed she had any right to remain. That night, the fire burned brighter in the teepee, yet its warmth could not ease the chill inside her. She thought of her husband again, of the quiet evenings they had shared, the sense of safety she had once known. That life was gone, buried beneath the earth with him. Now she stood in a place that was not hers, caught in the pull of a fate she could not yet see. The man's silence gave her no answers, yet his presence anchored her in ways she could not explain. Days passed, each one deepening the divide within the camp. Some of the women began to leave food quietly at the teepee's entrance, small gestures that carried hints of acceptance. Children, curious and unafraid, approached her with wide eyes, offering stones or feathers before darting away in laughter. Yet the men remained guarded, their suspicion sharpening with each passing day. The widow could feel it pressing against her like the cold wind. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in shades of red and gold, she stood at the edge of the clearing, watching smoke curl upward into the sky. She thought of the town she had left behind, the settlers who spoke only in fear of these people, and wondered what they would say if they saw her now. Would they call her foolish, or would they understand the strange pull that had brought her here? Perhaps they would never know. Perhaps she herself would never understand. The man joined her then, his footsteps quiet against the snow. He stood beside her, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They did not speak, but the silence between them carried weight, thick with the unspoken truth that their worlds were colliding in ways neither could control. When the darkness fell fully, a drumbeat rose from the center of the camp. Slow, steady, it echoed into the night, drawing the people together around the fire. The widow lingered at the edge, uncertain, yet drawn by the rhythm. Men and women circled the flames, their voices lifting in song, their movements carrying the weight of tradition older than any she had ever known. She watched, transfixed, as the firelight painted their faces, as the song rose higher into the night. But even as she felt the pull of that moment, she saw the glances cast her way. Some were watchful, others cold, and she knew then that this was more than survival. It was a test, one that would not be easily passed. As the song swelled and the fire burned brighter, the tall man's eyes met hers across the circle. For an instant, the rest of the camp seemed to fade, and she felt the sharp edge of what lay between them. It was not yet spoken, not yet named, but it was there, alive and dangerous. And as the night deepened, she knew the storm outside had only been the beginning. The greater storm was here, in this camp, in the unyielding silence between her and the people who watched her every move, waiting to see whether she would endure or be swept away. The drumbeat carried into the night, low and steady, pulsing through the cold air like a heartbeat. The widow stood at the edge of the circle, her hands pressed against her shawl, unsure if she belonged there at all. Faces glowed in the firelight, eyes sharp and watchful, and every flicker of their gaze reminded her that she was not one of them. Still, she could not pull herself away. The sound of the drums and voices wrapped around her like a storm, binding her in a moment she did not understand but could not deny. The tall man stood across the flames, his face lit in shades of red and gold, his presence steady as stone. When his eyes met hers, she felt the world narrow to that single thread of connection. But just as quickly as it formed, it was broken by the shift of the people around her. A group of men gathered, their voices rising above the song, sharp words cutting through the night. The widow could not understand, but she felt the weight of their anger. Their glances fell on her again and again, their hands gesturing toward her with open frustration. The tall man responded, his voice strong though it carried no anger. Yet the divide was clear. Some listened with silent respect, while others shook their heads, their disapproval heavy in the air. The widow's chest tightened. She had seen this before, in different ways. In her town, whispers had turned to stares, and stares had turned to walls she could not cross. Now, it was happening again, only here the walls were sharper, more dangerous. The drums quieted, the song fading as tension replaced it. The people turned toward the elder, the gray-haired man whose gaze had pinned her that first morning. His eyes swept over the gathering, steady and commanding. He spoke, his words slow and heavy, the weight of judgment in every syllable. When his eyes landed on her again, the widow felt her knees weaken. The firelight caught in his face, revealing no malice but no mercy either. The tall man answered, his tone unwavering, his stance firm. The two men locked in a silent battle, one of authority and one of resolve. Around them, the camp held its breath, waiting for the decision that would shape what came next. The widow stood frozen, her body trembling though the fire burned hot before her. She could not understand the words, but she understood enough. Her place here was not secure. Her presence was tearing at the seams of a community that had survived countless storms, and now they would decide if she was to remain or be cast into the cold. The elder's voice rose one last time, sharp and final, and the gathering broke apart. Men and women drifted back to their tipis, their faces unreadable, their whispers trailing through the night. The tall man did not move toward her. He stood in silence, watching the fire die down, his expression carved in stone. At last, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone on the edge of the clearing, the drums now silent, the night heavier than before. Sleep would not come easily. She lay near the fading fire in the teepee, her eyes wide, her mind racing. Every sound outside pulled her awake, the snap of branches, the crunch of footsteps, the murmur of voices carried on the wind. She felt like prey caught in a place that was not hers, watched from every shadow. Her body shivered not just from the cold, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. The next morning the camp moved with its usual rhythm, but the widow could feel the shift in the air. The children no longer came near with their laughter. The women glanced at her only once before turning their eyes away. The men spoke in tones that carried sharper edges, their words falling heavy as stones. She walked carefully, each step measured, as if one wrong movement could snap the fragile thread holding her in place. Yet even in the distance, she could see the tall man watching. He did not speak, but his gaze followed her, steady and unshaken. It was a strange comfort, though it did little to calm the storm inside her. She wanted to ask him why he had not turned her away that first night, why he had risked the anger of his people for her sake. But the words never formed. She could not speak his tongue, and he did not offer his. Their silence was a wall and a bridge all at once. As the days passed, the tension only grew. The young man who had once tried to drive her out grew bolder. His anger no longer whispered in the shadows, but carried in open stares. He watched her with eyes that burned, his hands tight on the hilt of his knife. Each time their paths crossed, she felt the threat like a blade against her throat. The widow began to sense that something was building, an inevitable clash that could not be avoided. The camp felt like dry kindling waiting for a spark, and she feared she might be the flame. She wondered if the man who had given her shelter knew this as well, if he understood that her presence might bring a storm greater than the snow that had driven her here in the first place. One night the wind howled again across the valley, rattling the teepee walls like warning drums. The widow sat awake, listening, her heart heavy with unease. She heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the teepee like a predator. Her breath caught, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. The steps paused, then moved on, fading into the storm. But sleep never came, and she sat in silence until dawn, her body trembling with the knowledge that she was not safe. By morning, the camp was restless. The men gathered in tight groups, their voices low but urgent. The elder's tone carried sharper now, his hands gesturing with impatience. The tall man stood firm, answering with calm strength, though the lines of strain had deepened across his face. The widow could feel the air thick with conflict, the divide widening with each passing hour. Later that day, she followed the edge of the clearing, searching for water at the frozen stream. The cold bit into her skin, her fingers raw as she cracked through the ice. She knelt there, her reflection rippling in the shallow pool, when a shadow fell over her. Lifting her eyes, she saw the young man again, his knife glinting faintly at his side. His voice was low, filled with venom she did not need to understand. He stepped closer, his shadow long across the snow. The widow's heart raced, her body frozen in place. She wanted to run, but her legs would not obey. The silence of the woods pressed in around them, broken only by the sound of his boots crunching nearer. Then a voice rang out from behind, sharp and commanding. The tall man emerged from the trees, his stance powerful, his eyes locked on the younger one. Words flew between them, fast and heated, the air thick with anger. The young man's grip on his knife tightened, but the elder warrior's presence seemed unshakable. The widow stood frozen between them, fear clenching her chest as she watched the clash unfold. The younger man finally spat into the snow, his anger unspent but his challenge unmet. With a sharp motion, he turned and stalked away, his shoulders stiff with fury. The widow's knees nearly gave beneath her as relief and dread mingled in equal measure. The tall man did not speak. He only looked at her, his eyes burning with something unspoken, before turning back toward the camp. That night, the widow knew there was no turning back. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside these walls. Every glance, every whisper, every clash of voices built toward something she could not yet see, but she felt it pressing closer with each passing moment. The camp was a tinderbox, and the spark was near. She sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she tried to warm them, her eyes fixed on the flicker of flames. She thought of her husband again, of the life that had been stolen from her, and wondered if she had been led here for a reason she could not yet name. Perhaps her grief had carried her to this place not to find peace, but to face a storm greater than any she had known. The man entered once more, his presence filling the space, his silence heavier than words. He sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the fire, his jaw tight with the weight of choices yet to be made. Outside, voices rose again, sharper, louder, carrying anger that could no longer be contained. The widow's breath came shallow, her heart pounding as she realized the moment was near. The storm was breaking, and when it did, nothing would remain the same. The firelight flickered across the tipi walls, painting restless shadows as the widow sat with her hands trembling, her breath shallow. The storm outside had settled into a biting wind, but the storm within the camp was reaching its breaking point. Voices carried through the air, sharp with anger and distrust, men gathering in clusters, women whispering as they moved quickly about their tasks, children pulled closer to their mothers' sides. The air felt charged, like the moments before lightning splits the sky. She knew the time had come when all the quiet tension of her presence would no longer remain silent. The man who had given her shelter finally rose, stepping out into the night where the crowd had gathered. The widow hesitated, torn between fear and the pull to know what fate awaited her. At last she followed, clutching her shawl tight, and stepped into the clearing where fire burned high, its sparks scattering into the cold dark. Around it stood the elder, his face lit in the flames, stern and unyielding, the younger men restless at his side, their voices low but filled with threat. The widow felt every eye turn on her as she emerged, the weight of their judgment falling like heavy stone. The elder spoke first, his words measured but hard, carrying the authority of generations. She could not understand the language, but the tone left no doubt. Her presence was the matter at hand, her future hanging in the balance. The younger men growled agreement, their bodies tense, their stares sharp with hostility. She stood frozen, her heart pounding so loud it seemed to drown all other sound. Then the tall man spoke, his voice cutting steady through the noise. He did not shout, but the strength in his words carried across the circle. His gaze swept the crowd, his stance firm, his presence unshaken, even as the air trembled with opposition. He looked to the elder and held his ground, refusing to yield. The men around shifted, some bristling in anger, others quieting in thought. The widow could see it, the fracture running through the camp, one side pushing for rejection, the other listening to the voice of the man who had given her shelter. The debate stretched on, sharp and heated, but at last the elder raised his hand, his voice lowering into finality. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward as the people slowly dispersed, some with heads bowed, others with frustration heavy in their steps. The younger man, the one who had confronted her near the stream, lingered with anger flashing in his eyes before turning away into the darkness. The widow did not know the words that had been spoken, but she knew the meaning. She was still there. She had not been cast out into the cold, and though the looks she received told her she had not yet been accepted, the decision had been made that she would remain, at least for now. Relief washed over her, but with it came an even deeper weight. She was bound to this place now in ways she could not walk away from. In the days that followed, the rhythm of camp life returned, though it was changed. The children crept closer once more, offering shy smiles as they circled around her. The women, though still guarded, began to include her in small tasks, showing her where to gather water, how to tend the fire properly, offering gestures that spoke louder than words. She listened, watched, and learned, moving with care as she found her place among them. Slowly, suspicion softened into cautious tolerance. The tall man remained her anchor. His silence was no longer a wall but a steady presence, a reminder that though the world around her was unfamiliar, she was not alone. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would sit with her near the fire, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. Their eyes would meet, and though no words passed, something deeper was exchanged. An understanding that neither had sought, but both had found. The young man who had opposed her so fiercely did not vanish. He kept his distance, but his glances still burned, his disapproval sharp as ever. Yet he did not act again, and the widow understood that the decision of the elder and the tall man had been final enough to restrain him, though not to erase his anger. That shadow lingered, a reminder that her place here was still fragile, still tied to threads that could fray with one wrong step. Winter held strong, the snow deepening, the nights long. Yet within the camp, warmth grew in unexpected ways. The widow's hands, once awkward with new tasks, grew steady. She found herself laughing softly with the children, sharing smiles with the women, and discovering a strength within herself she had thought buried with her husband. The grief that had once been her only companion loosened its grip, though it did not vanish. It lingered in quiet moments, but now it shared space with something new, a sense of belonging, however fragile. She came to realize that her journey had not been only about survival. It had been about finding meaning again in a world that had stripped so much from her. The storm had driven her to this valley, but something greater had kept her here. Something that had drawn her to a man whose silence spoke more than any words. One evening, when the snow had settled into a calm hush and the fire burned low, the tall man finally broke that silence. His words were careful, slow, as though bridging the vast gap between their languages. He spoke her name, the first time she had heard it in his voice, and the sound of it startled her with its quiet strength. He said little else, but it was enough. In that moment she felt the thread between them tighten, no longer fragile but strong, woven by choice rather than chance. The elder watched, and though his gaze remained stern, there was no longer the sharp edge of rejection. He had seen enough to know the widow was no threat, and perhaps even something more. Someone who had endured, who had chosen life when it would have been easier to surrender. As the days stretched into weeks, and the harshest winds began to soften, the widow stood at the edge of the valley, watching the land shift beneath the slow approach of spring. The snow melted in patches, the ground revealing itself once more, and with it came the promise of change. She thought of the town she had left behind, the cold stares and whispered judgments, and knew she could never return. Her path had carried her here, to this place, to these people, and to the man who had offered her fire when the world had only offered her loss. The conflict that had nearly torn the camp apart had settled, though its memory lingered. Trust was not easily won, and acceptance would take time. But the widow understood now that her life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she chose to build. Her grief would remain a part of her, but it no longer held the power to drown her. She turned back toward the tipi, where smoke curled softly into the sky and voices carried in gentle rhythm. The tall man stood near the fire, his eyes finding hers as if he had been waiting. The widow stepped forward, her heart steady, the cold no longer biting in the same way it once had. She had entered this place as a stranger, driven by loss and desperation. She remained now by choice, her path forever changed by the night she had stepped into an Apache tipi and found something she never thought she would again, a place where she belonged. The story of the widow and the Apache man was not one of simple endings. It was a story of grief met with strength, of mistrust met with quiet resolve, of survival met with the chance for new beginnings. It was proof that even in the midst of the coldest storms, a spark of warmth could change everything. And as the last of winter's grip loosened its hold on the valley, the widow stood beside the man who had given her fire, ready to face whatever came next. The storm had not broken her. It had led her to the life waiting beyond it.